With a new study now suggesting that it was at least 45 meters long, Barosaurus may well be the longest sauropod dinosaur known to science. But there's a bit more to the story than just that. Hi, it's me. This is my channel. Join me today as we learn about Barosaurus. I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of people are familiar with the sauropod dinosaurs. Thanks to their depiction in the popular media, we know them as the really big plant-eating dinosaurs with long necks, and long tails and small heads and 4 thick legs that supported their massive bodies. And these dinosaurs were not only some of the largest animals to ever exist, but they were also among the longest. Just think of the likes of Argentinosaurus, Patagotitan, and Supersaurus. These dinosaurs truly had incredibly long bodies. Now, while the sauropods were mostly huge and long animals, there was actually a great deal of diversity within this group. For example, the Diplodocids, which included Diplodocus and Brachiosaurus, were generally much less robust than other sauropods. In fact, Diplodocids were known for being extremely slender animals with very narrow ribs. And Barosaurus was possibly the most extreme of these long and slender dinosaurs. You see, Barosaurus was first described by O. Citinakiumesi Marsh back in 1877, originally under the name Thescelosaurus. He later realized, however, that the name Thescelosaurus was preoccupied by another genus of mammal, so he renamed the animal Barosaurus. Originally, Marsh based his new genus on a few articulated ribs that he believed belonged to an adult. Later, more material was found, including some skull material and a partial skeleton. It was from these additional remains that the general public became familiar with Barosaurus. However, up until recently, all of the material that had been assigned to Barosaurus consisted of either immature or juvenile specimens. No complete adult skeletons have ever been found. As a result, scientists never had a good idea of what an adult Barosaurus looked like. They figured that they were about as large as their close relative Diplodocus, so they reconstructed them as similar to that animal, just maybe a little bit larger. However, without any complete adult skeletons, it was difficult to say for sure. But then, in 2013, a massive cervical vertebra turned up in Wyoming. The vertebra came from the Hell Creek Formation, the same formation where Sue the T-Rex and countless other famous fossils have been found. Now, the thing is, this vertebrae was so large that it didn't fit the description of vertebrae from Barosaurus that had been collected previously. Not only that, but its size suggested that it came from an animal that was far too large for anything known from the Hell Creek. A few years later, in 2019, a paper was published that suggested that this giant vertebra belonged to a new sauropod genus named Tenontosaurus. Now, this wasn't the only time that someone proposed a new genus of dinosaur from a single vertebra. And anyone who has been following my content for a while now will know that those sorts of descriptions often turn out to be invalid. So I didn't hold my breath waiting for this new genus to be accepted by the wider scientific community. Well, it seems that my suspicions were correct because a new study has now come along and reassigned this giant vertebra to Barosaurus. In the new study, the authors performed a complete osteological and taphonomic study of the vertebra. They conducted a geometric morphometric analysis of the morphology of the bone. They established its age and they assessed its pathological condition. What they concluded was that the vertebra was not only from an adult animal, but it was also likely around 30 years old. Furthermore, they concluded that the vertebra belonged to a Barosaurus, not a new sauropod genus. Why? Well, it turns out that Barosaurus grew to be far larger than previously thought. They estimate that Barosaurus reached lengths of 45 meters and weighed around 60 tons when fully grown. That makes them longer than even Diplodocus, which was around 40 meters in length. And to put these dimensions into context, just think about an animal like Argentinosaurus. That dinosaur was estimated to be around 30 meters long and weighed about 70 tons. So Barosaurus was pretty close in size to that animal. All things considered, It's easy to understand why the authors of the study feel confident in their identification of the fossil. The main evidence against this specimen being a Barosaurus was that it was far too large for the Barosaurus material that had been collected previously. Now, the authors could argue that this isn't evidence against it being a Barosaurus because the previous material came from immature specimens. But what does this mean for the debate over which sauropod was the longest of all time? Well, if you've been watching my content for a while now, then you'll already know that I've covered a number of studies that have argued for a number of different dinosaurs being the largest animals to ever exist. Generally speaking, the length estimates given by these papers vary depending on which animal they are arguing for. Some of these papers are based on fairly limited amounts of data, and others are based on much more complete skeletons. In many cases, it's impossible to compare the data given in these papers directly with each other because the methodology used varies so much from study to study. But the study describing Barosaurus can be compared with the study describing Patagotitan because both of these studies used body mass to estimate overall length. The authors of the Patagotitan study estimated that their specimen weighed between 74 and 82 tons. They then went on to estimate the total length of the animal at between 36.7 and 41.8 meters. Meanwhile, the authors of the Barosaurus study estimated that their specimen weighed around 60 tons. They didn't give a total length estimate, but they did give a maximum length estimate of 45 meters. So, how do these two animals compare? Well, it depends on exactly which estimate you want to use. If you use the minimum weight and length estimates from each study, then Barosaurus comes out on top. According to these figures, Barosaurus would have been about 45 meters long. Meanwhile, Patagotitan would have been about 36.7 meters long. If, however, you use the maximum weight and minimum length estimates, then Patagotitan wins out at 41.8 meters. And finally, if you use the average weight and length estimates, then Barosaurus would win out at 41.225 meters long. Of course, these are just estimates, and the true length of these animals might have been quite different. Indeed, the true length of Barosaurus might have been much longer than 45 meters. It's worth remembering that the study used a single vertebra to identify Barosaurus. A complete skeleton could easily reveal that Barosaurus was even longer than 45 meters. Not only that, but the study also revealed that Barosaurus had an extremely long neck. In fact, Barosaurus had the longest neck of any sauropod known to science. What's fascinating is that the neck accounted for nearly half of the total length of the animal, coming in at around 21 meters long. Now, Barosaurus lived during the Late Jurassic period, specifically during the Morrisonian Age. It lived in what is now North America, specifically in the famous Morrison Formation in Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. From this formation, we're also familiar with other dinosaurs such as Stegosaurus, Brachiosaurus, and Allosaurus. In fact, half of the most well-known stock dinosaurs lived at the same time and in the same place as Barosaurus. It's incredible to think that Barosaurus was basically unknown until 1977, yet it was part of a fauna that's been famous since the late 1800s. Perhaps in the future we'll find more fossils of Barosaurus, and perhaps they will show us that this dinosaur was even larger than 45 meters. Until that happens, though, it seems safe to say that Barosaurus was the longest sauropod and possibly the longest dinosaur known to science. So, what do you think of Barosaurus? Is it your favorite sauropod? Let me know down below. Don't forget to subscribe. And, as always, thank you so much for watching.